Hello, everybody. Good evening, good evening, good evening. We're just going to do pretty short, half an hour, 45-minute stream tonight. I'll give a few minutes before I start to see if anyone's around tonight and if anyone is able to hop in and hang out. Just have a few things to talk about tonight. A little bit about what's happening here in the United States with the Somali fraud in Minnesota, the protests against ICE, why ICE is even being protested to begin with, regardless of the fact or regardless of whether or not their tactics are unethical or cross the line. Where does the origin of these protests come from? Is it really just about bleeding hearts for humanity or something a little more nefarious? I'd like to talk a little bit too about what's taking place in Ukraine, the launch of the Orezhnik as a deterrent, or a form of deterrence against NATO and the United States specifically, what's happening with the war in Ukraine overall, what's happening with the United States' foreign policy and why it's conducting itself the way that it is now, and why, and I mentioned this in the video that I posted earlier today, hasn't really seemed to caught the algorithm yet, unfortunately. So if you are watching this and have the opportunity, please go watch the video I posted earlier today. It's about international law basically being dead, why it's dead, and what I think the world is going to look like moving forward. If you're interested, give that a watch. I'll be talking a little bit about that tonight. I think I'll just give it another minute or two to see if anyone hops on. It's a very unseasonably warm day today. Actually, the last 2 days. It was 60 degrees yesterday, and today it's in the 50s, which is pretty warm for January, but the temperature is about to swing back down into the 30s and lower starting tomorrow. I think I'm at the point now where I'd rather have one or the other. If we're going to have southern weather, at least have it stick around. If it's going to be a mild winter, so be it, stay mild. Not have these drastic temperature swings that just ruin everyone's sinuses. 1 week the temperature will get up into the 50s and then just plummet back down into the 30s or lower. And I guarantee by the end of the month into February, it's probably going to be down in the teens, if not below zero. So it's a pretty wild temperature swing for one season. I'm not really sure if it's because of the proximity of where I live at to the Great Lakes. I'm about 2 hours south of Lake Erie. We do get some lake effect weather, some lake effect snow a little bit down here. Weather systems definitely are affected by the Great Lakes for sure. And I'm not entirely sure if the temperature swings we get are thanks to the Great Lakes or how much of a part they play in it, but we definitely do get some pretty drastic temperature swings around here in the winter. And then once summer rolls around, it's in between 80 and 90 for the majority of the summer, and then that just kind of drops off at a point, and it starts being 40 to 50 degrees for at least like 5 months out of the year before it warms back up. I actually live in Appalachia, not deep Appalachia, but kind of like the northwest edge of Appalachia, if you will. But the county that I'm in is squarely within like the definite historical boundaries of Appalachia. But we get a little more snow and colder temperatures than I'd say like the more southern parts of Appalachia, down into Virginia and the Carolinas. But the terrain is pretty similar. It's very hilly, lots of hollers, not quite mountainous, but the hills can be pretty rugged, and then some places around where I live at do kind of make you feel like you're up in the mountains. But anyways, let's just get this started. Nobody's hopped in yet, but that's okay. If anyone's around, come in, hang out. If not, and you're out enjoying yourselves on a Saturday night, hey, so be it. have fun. All right. So I think the first thing I want to talk about, just go over briefly. I'm not really huge on talking about American politics sometimes. I just feel like it's boring. I'm kind of burned out on it. I do usually do one video a week involving something about American politics, but it's usually like the thing I look forward to the least. My forte is more geopolitics, but I guess I can discuss what's happening in Minneapolis now that I've seen all angles of this video, of the incident that happened. I can give a better opinion on that. So ICE is going around the country arresting immigrants that don't have the proper paperwork, are here past their expiration of their visa, are here outright illegally. Unfortunately, for years, our presidential administrations haven't really enforced some of our immigration laws the way that they should. This problem has compounded itself over the last few decades to the point where immigration is illegal immigration is a pretty serious issue in this country. We have millions of people living here that are undocumented, and never should have happened. We always should have had a secure border, but unfortunately, due to some people thinking it was advantageous from a political point of view to open the borders and allow a bunch of people to flood in, well, here we are. I think everybody knows what the calculus was. Bring a lot of people in, let them stay, eventually give them amnesty, and then you flip a couple states over to your side politically. If anyone thinks that the people that run this country are above just brutal, cutthroat politics to that extent, you are very naive. I think both sides are more than willing to sacrifice the greater good of the country in some cases to ensure their positions of power. Anyways, ICE is enforcing immigration law. Some people think that it's being taken too far. There are some people that think immigration status basically makes you a saint. If you're here in any capacity as an immigrant, then you are the most righteous and good person on the planet, and you must be protected at all costs. Laws that every other country enforces be damned. And so we have a bit of a clash of ideologies taking place. You have, I would say, anarcho-leftists that think that there should be no borders, countries shouldn't have a standard of who they let in, and no human is illegal. A bunch of just idiotic stuff that no country is governed based upon. Even if you move to a country that is very communist or socialist leaning, they don't have immigration policies even remotely resembling that. I'm sorry if the Soviet Union didn't just let hordes of people in on a whim. China doesn't do it. Cuba doesn't do it. North Korea damn sure doesn't do it. No country on this planet has a domestic policy like that except for Western Europe and the United States. I think it's suicidal and stupid from a pragmatic point of view. I mean, not even from like a nationalist perspective. It is just bad policy and leads to the destabilization of your country. If you're going to have immigration of any kind at all, it needs to be controlled, it needs to be monitored, and there needs to be a definite process to it to make sure that the number of people coming in is being kept track of. The people that are being brought in will make for good and productive citizens that aren't going to bring any kind of like destabilizing factors into the country. Immigration needs to be looked at like that, like almost every single country does. But we do have a faction in this country that thinks, like just enforcing immigration law at all is akin to like the second coming of Mussolini, or the man from the 1930s that our entire political religion is based off of. And every time I hear some kind of comparison to this particular person and the war that they started, I just roll my eyes, because geopolitically, the world doesn't change and we're ever stuck in 1938. But anyways, so ICE was in Minneapolis finding people to deport. There was an altercation between somebody who seems to be an activist of some kind and a police officer, or an ICE officer. It appears that she maybe panicked to get away from him while also behaving somewhat aggressively. He pulled his firearm to defend himself from what I believe he perceived to be a vehicle attempting to run him over. Anyways, the woman was shot. She was killed. It's unfortunate. I don't like to see women die in any capacity, even if they are putting themselves in a situation where they're in danger because they're behaving recklessly and foolishly. It's never a good thing to see. Um, federal officers, especially armed, are going to protect themselves with deadly force at the drop of a hat, especially in a situation where they have been attacked in the past by activists. ICE officers, I'm sure, are probably very stressed out doing what they're doing. There's been death threats, attacks, shootings. It's just a bad situation all around. Anyways, the woman was shot, she was killed, and now there appears to be some very serious political turmoil over it. While I don't think things are going to reach George Floyd levels by any means, I think politically the Democrats know that's just not a good look, even though Trump is in office. I think people are tired of the chaos and destruction. They understand that, so I don't expect that these protests will turn into anything violence. I think they're probably going to hold the reins a little more tightly this time because it just isn't good politically for this to happen. They can't get away with it a second time. I don't really see anything too crazy taking place because of this, at least at this time. I'm pretty sure the Democrats will try to use this as fuel to the fire to push the narrative that Trump is out of control. He's behaving like a particular person from the 1930s. ICE is just like the Gestapo because we can't move past the 1930s because it's our civilizational religion at this point. And I don't know. I mean, the whole situation is unfortunate. I frankly shouldn't have happened. I think one contributing factor to this is that we have an entire class of people that view themselves, and I don't know much about this woman, so I'm just speculating based off what I've seen, and I'm not specifically talking about her, but just in general, we have, I think, a lot of activists in this country, or wannabe activists, that don't really understand violence. They don't understand what it means when someone is armed and given the authority to use deadly force, or even have the legal ability to use deadly force. And I think they often put themselves in situations where they are placed in danger of being on the receiving end of that force and behave in such ways to ensure that that force is brought down upon them, and they seem to be dumbfounded and confused when it happens, and outraged. If you're in a vehicle and you have an armed officer of any kind is approaching your vehicle, and you start behaving aggressively and erratically and moving your vehicle towards them, even if you're trying to escape, it's probably a recipe for disaster. There's a good chance that officer will open fire. Now, whether you could say that officer was being jumpy, jumped the gun, poor training, what have you, regardless, if you are a civilian and you're in a situation like that, for the love of God, don't do anything stupid or aggressive. It's not going to make you a hero. It's not going to make you a martyr. You're just going to die needlessly, and that's it. That's it. You're not fighting fascism. You're just being an idiot. I'm not saying that to be a bootlicker, but it's just the truth. Please don't be stupid. And as I mentioned, about people not really understanding violence. Like, we do have a lot of people in this country, and I've seen this happen quite a few times, where you have like leftist agitators, if you will, or leftist activists will behave aggressively or violently towards somebody, and then when that person uses force back at them, they seem to be dumbfounded and confused, shocked and scared about what just happened. We saw that with Kyle Rittenhouse. You have a young armed man, okay, in an area where violence is happening. There's a riot, there's things burning, and he's armed with a rifle, a semi-automatic AR pattern rifle. Is it a good idea to charge this person aggressively and swing a skateboard at them? They are within their legal rights at that point of being beaten over the head with a heavy piece of wood and steel to use deadly force, especially if they haven't shot at you yet and you're beating them over the head with something. And there's still, to this day, even when you clearly see what happened in that entire sequence of events, there's still people that call this particular young man, oh, he was a murderer. He just went there and just shot people on a whim for no reason at all. And I think it's kind of incomprehensible that you can look at that situation, analyze it, and that's what you walk away with. But again, I think these people just don't really understand violence. what leads to violence and how violence works. I've seen plenty of protests where drivers panicked and cornered and people are swarming their car, and then an absolute again, this isn't involving police officers, this is involving civilians, but you have a bunch of civilian agitators and protesters swarming somebody in a vehicle, punching their windows, kicking, shouting, and then that person tries to get away, because who knows what's going to happen. Are they going to be pulled out and beaten to death? They don't know that. The people that are surrounding their vehicle are under no authority or restrictions on what could happen to that person. Really, they're not serving in any kind of capacity as an officer. Well, that person speeds away in a panic, and then somebody just opens fire on the car. And I've seen a lot of leftists look at situations like that and they say, well, it was totally justified. You surrounded somebody, punched and kicked their vehicle, and they tried to get away from you. That's not an excuse to shoot somebody. Now, somebody might say, well, you're saying that now when you just said what you said about this shooting in Minneapolis. Yes, again, there's a difference. You have an armed officer of the law attempting to stop you, and then you move your vehicle in his direction and speed away, versus a mob of civilians attacking a vehicle with the driver inside of it, and that person panicking and trying to get away. They're not resisting arrest or doing anything illegal. They're trying to get away from a situation they feel to be dangerous. So yes, I think there is a bit of a difference there. And I really hope and pray that you don't have a bunch of wannabe revolutionaries out there that think it's time to fight the empire and really commit themselves to some kind of act that could lead to an unfortunate chain reaction of violence and make things much worse and much less stable in this country. I frankly, from my point of view, I don't think the federal government is acting like a fascist government, so to speak. It's just asserting its authority over immigration policy, maybe doing so in a way that's a little provocative, doing so in a way that is inflaming public tensions a bit. Maybe they should be just specializing on drug dealers and criminals rather than generally law-abiding people. But then again, if you're here illegally, you're not abiding the law anyways. So I don't know. I pray the situation doesn't get worse. I think if President Trump is going to commit himself to following through with these mass deportations, and they really have to mean it, and they have to really assert federal authority here, because if they appear to be weak, and I've heard other people on the right talk about this, and I'm not on here as an advocate, I'm simply looking at this from an analyst's point of view. If they show any kind of weakness, then that I think will embolden agitators and people that are willing to commit violence against federal agents. It's just the way it is. So this is the situation that the Trump administration put themselves in regards to enforcing immigration policy. They probably, for their own sake, should follow through on enforcing it. Now, from a leftist agitator's point of view, I think they also need to realize too that yes, it's all well and good to be caught up in revolutionary fervor, but I think they also should realize too that much of the country does want immigration policy enforced, and they don't view this as some kind of existential fight against spray tan man from the 1930s. I think there's a bit of a disconnect between how they view the world and how they view the country versus the average citizen. If the average citizen, if they don't like what they see, they say, well, maybe that's a little too harsh. I'm not a big fan of this immigration policy. Perhaps we shouldn't be doing things like this. I'm not going to take it so far as to call for a literal civil war and revolution. I just want to mention one thing too, before I move on to the next topic. When it comes to the idea of civil war, I've seen a lot of people cheer for it. Now's the time for our great revolution. And I've seen it on both sides. Now's the time to really fight back, and let's go get them. Yeah, I think people really need to understand what a second civil war in America would actually look like. It wouldn't be the military fighting. If it was an actual civil war, it wouldn't be the military fighting Antifa or the military fighting rednecks and pickup trucks. No, it would be military versus military. Abrams tanks versus Abrams tanks, F-15s versus F-15s, trained military versus trained military personnel, back with paramilitaries. It would be a bloodbath. Millions dead, country destroyed, everything that our parents built, everything we would want to build gone overnight. So I would really prefer to find a better way forward, because I understand what civil wars in a country like ours would actually look like. I think a lot of people are naive when it comes to that. I would much prefer to find a political solution to this point for this country's problems. I'd rather see our country be governed by people that are pragmatic, realistic, also that have a Christian framework to their morality, but are also care more about the well-being and prosperity and stability of America. That's what I want. I don't want a bunch of revolutionaries and political radicals at each other's throats, both attempting to build the perfect world, because I don't like the idea of my entire family dying because they're caught in the middle of that. Anyways, not to be too dramatic here, but let's move on to the next topic. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but international law, I think as a concept, it's dead. And not that it was ever really alive to begin with, but I think people are going to stop paying it lip service in all seriousness. It's useful. It was so. I mentioned this in my video earlier today, but it's very useful for Russia and China to cite international law because they want to appear as non-imperialist and to not be colonizers, the antithesis of everything the West is accused of being. So they often do cite international law and come to the defense of countries that are perceived to be being victimized by the West, because they want to appear to be the good alternative to the United States of America. They want to appear to be more willing to join economic unions and have nice, lucrative trade deals than be that imposing force that brings down their will upon countries that are weaker than them. Like they want to seem less aggressive in their foreign policy to make alliances with them more attractive. I think that's why they cite international law so much. But ultimately, at the end of the day, and I'm not knocking Russia and China, their own interests come first. And if there's some kind of UN provision that gets in the way of that, well, they'll find a way around it. The difference now, though, between them and the United States is that the United States has dropped all pretense to that. And I think the Trump administration has decided, well, look, if our foreign policy has always been based on pragmatic realism while pretending it's not, let's just drop the facade here and just let everyone know. Yeah, we're pragmatic realists, and we're going to throw around the weight of the United States to gain every single advantage in this new multipolar world that we can. Hey, what's up, last independent thinker? I figured you'd be around tonight. Things are good. Things are good. Off work for the next couple of days. It's been a nice, relaxing weekend so far. I figured I would just hop on here for a bit, do my Saturday night live stream. Watch an interesting vid. Yeah, the Rothschild family. Yeah, that's a very interesting topic. They seem to have had their fingers in a lot of different things in the last 100 years or so. When you research the last few major wars that we've had, well, they've had some connections with a good bit of it. Not a very reputable family, to say the least. I think they've been responsible for a lot of pain and misery across the world. Unfortunately, there's been a few prominent families that have been responsible for a lot of terrible things and haven't really done anything for the betterment of humanity. Here's the thing. If you're a powerful, noble family and you're doing things for the interest of your country in particular, to make your country a better place and to lift your people up, that's one thing. But I think people like the Rothschilds just do it for their particular family. That's it, and their own self-interest. So I see nothing noble about the way they conduct themselves at all. They're not great leaders. They're not great statesmen. They're just bankers, rich and wealthy people using their influence to ingratiate themselves at the cost of the rest of the planet. So not a big fan of the Rothschilds. But I hope you're doing well. How are things in Australia? I hope it's a bit warmer. than it has been here over the last month. Even though today was pretty warm, it's about to get pretty cold again. Anyways, back to what I was talking about. I think people that were advocating for a multipolar world in the absence of U.S. hegemony, I think sort of we're a little naive about what that means and what that's going to look like. I think countries are going to be very competitive, very ruthless with one another to secure their own interests now that they know that the United States is more focused on their own hemisphere. I think if you're the leader of a small country next to a much larger power, they need to be much more careful and intelligent how they conduct themselves. Here's a prime example, and this might upset a few people, but this is my honest opinion on this. Ukraine. Would Ukraine have been better off, in hindsight, seeing what we've seen over the last 4 years? Ukraine would have, and again, if somebody out there is watching this and they're pro-Ukraine, I understand, I get it. But I'm talking about this from a realist perspective. And sometimes if you're the leader of a country, you have to make decisions that you must hold your nose while making, but they might be the best decision at the end of the day. So Ukraine would have been much better off if it had declared itself nominally neutral, declared years ago that it would never join NATO, do the few things that Russia was demanding to placate Russia. They would have kept Crimea. Crimea would still be theirs to this day. If there was no threat at all of Western powers gaining influence over Crimea and Sevastopol, it would still be theirs. Russia wouldn't have taken it. And also the entirety of the Donbass would still be theirs at this point if they had declared a policy of outright neutrality and leaned just enough towards the Russians to keep them happy and placated. Because prior to 2014, Vladimir Putin was very eager to appease the West. He's probably the most pro-Western Russian leader that the Russians have had since Peter the Great. And that is the one thing that he's constantly criticized for within his own country by hardliners, is he's too soft and naive about the West. Ukraine could have taken advantage of that. They could have placed themselves in a position where they were largely neutral between two major power blocs, and they could have benefited tremendously economically from that. Just lean enough toward the Russians to keep them happy and have a positive, good relationship with the EU and the US. That is what they should have done. Now, in hindsight, would that have even been possible with the leadership that they had in the country and the corruption? I don't know. But in hindsight, if they would have conducted themselves in that way much more intelligently and they weren't being guided by a bunch of nationalist revolutionaries, they would be much better off. Their sovereignty would be generally intact. They would probably have much more autonomy than Belarus. Belarus is, essentially under Russia's thumb. Belarus's policy, foreign policy, and elections are always going to be steered in the way that Russia sees fit. And they just happen to have a leader in there who's very pro-Russian now, so they don't really have to do a whole lot of political maneuvering behind the scenes. But once Lukashenko's out, I think they will be pulled much further into the Russian sphere of influence than they are now, which from Russia's standpoint, I think is very understandable. Belarus, White Russia, Yellow Russia, was always part of the Russian Empire. And I think it will probably never be a fully independent state, although I think NATO will probably try to interfere there and make it a second Ukraine. I would hope any future leader of Belarus after Lukashenko's gone would think twice about that, just for the betterment of their own people, who wants to watch their country ripped apart by two major power blocs, both vying for influence within it, when they could have just stuck with whatever policy would keep their country intact. But case in point, that is what the Ukrainians should have done in hindsight. They would have preserved their demographics, preserved their territorial integrity, and preserved their sovereignty, and preserved their economy. And they wouldn't have lost well over 1 million men at this point, with millions more leaving the country never to return. That would have been the better option in hindsight. So I think other countries in similar positions to Ukraine should probably conduct themselves a bit more intelligently going forward, and should probably listen to the whims and the wishes and the needs of their larger, much more powerful neighbors. Taiwan, for example. I think the faction that governs, I think the pro-Chinese political faction in Taiwan will eventually win out. Yeah, I mean, Ukraine was hung out to dry by the U.S., but that was always the plan. The Ukraine is going to be used as a battering ram against Russia. And then once they served their purpose, they were going to be hung out to dry. There was a lot of people within Western media that were telling the Ukrainians back, this is the beginning of the war, don't bother, will be your fate. Please sign a peace treaty as quickly as you can while your territory is still intact. You will be hung out to dry. They were, because that's how the United States government conducts itself. And yeah, sure, again, though, giving them, so from what I understand, and I don't really want to get too much into this, those nuclear weapons were the property of the Soviet Union. The Russian Federation is considered the successor state to the Soviet Union, so therefore they argue that those nukes were there, those nukes were given back to Russia, and I don't really think it was in anyone's best interest at the time to have another nuclear power in Europe. I think the French and the United Kingdom would prefer that those nuclear weapons are only for them and nobody else, because it complicates things. Did that appease Russia? Yeah, I'm sure it did, because Russia has concerns about Ukraine, as any major power has concerns about its neighbors, like the United States, for example. We don't like the fact that cartels run Mexico. They view that as a national security threat. And I believe the United States is about to take action against the Mexican drug cartels, regardless of how much Mexico complains about its sovereignty because of that. This is a long festering problem that Mexico should have dealt with decades ago. But then again, soft-handed U.S. policy led the Mexicans to believe that this is something they could just tolerate and allow to fester, and nothing is ever going to happen about it. But eventually, at some point, the United States was always going to start taking an aggressive stance towards Mexico over these drug cartels. If Mexico ever decided to enter any kind of, say, pro-Chinese alliance to protect itself from possible U.S. aggression by maybe shipping in Chinese weapons, tanks, and aircraft, or what have you, Mexico would be invaded within 24 hours after that decision is made. The United States will aggressively, and people might not like this, and I'm not advocating for it, but this is just the reality of how great powers behave. The United States would respond like that immediately. Same way. There would be some kind of casus belli for military intervention immediately if Canada ever were to join some kind of formal agreement with any of the United States' adversaries. So that's my point, though, like about Ukraine or any smaller nation next to a larger one that doesn't find itself currently to be part of a larger alliance. Think ahead before any decision is made. Think about how your larger neighbor will react to whatever you decide to do, is the point I'm making, especially now that the world is shifting towards multipolarity, because the world's great powers are starting to equal out in strength just enough to ensure that no major power could ever actually really afford at this point to enter an outright war against another, which is why I think to at least try to preserve world peace as best we can, there has to be some kind of détente, some kind of understanding between China, Russia, the United States, maybe India and Japan. It has to be some kind of formal meeting between the world's major centers of power to figure out where everyone's boundaries are, to try to stay within those boundaries as best we can to avoid major conflicts. Now, espionage and proxy conflicts will still happen. These countries will still test each other's boundaries and try to find every edge they can. But I think given the stakes and how much weaponry we all possess, I think it's probably a good idea. There has to be, and last independent thinker, you're in Australia, so China is actually like a possible threat to your country because of your proximity to China and Chinese interests. There has to be, I think, some kind of understanding that, sure, China's sphere of influence might be Southeast Asia, but there has to be a line there somewhere. Australia is firmly within the Western world. It's part of Western civilization. I think the Western world has the right to defend Australia's territorial integrity because of that. It's a complicated issue. It's not something that would be hammered out and agreed upon overnight. And I'm not even sure it's possible to have some kind of longstanding agreement between this triumvirate of nations. I don't know. That would be my suggestion as a way to move forward without causing too much bloodshed. I don't know. We'll see, though. I think there's going to be a lot of military posturing taking place over the next few years between Russia, China, and the United States. I think the seizure of that oil tanker was meant to send a message to the Russians, and that Orezhnik strike that hit Lvov, I think that's how you pronounce it, and apparently destroyed that underground gas reservoir, was meant to send a message. And the Chinese exercises around Taiwan are all meant to send a message. So all three great powers are currently posturing against one another to ensure that not one of us really makes too much of an aggressive move towards the other. Like there's an attempt to check each other's power and aggression to maintain like our current status quo. And I think that that's going to continue. And I think really the only way to move forward is some kind of understanding between the world's great powers on how we're going to move forward in a way that's mutually beneficial for everybody. And unfortunately, and much to unfortunately, moving forward, there are some nations that are going to be caught in the middle of that and part of decisions that they may not like. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's a positive thing, but this is inevitably what's going to happen. Certain nations are going to be put on the chopping block because, say like the United States interests in certain countries, it's just not worth it. Like you mentioned with Ukraine, how Ukraine got hung out to dry. The United States government has taken a long, hard look at Ukraine and figured, look, this is really in our long-term interest anyway. So, sorry, the United States has a very bad habit of doing that, of getting themselves involved in an area where they're not willing to stay long-term and to make a long-term commitment towards. And they, after they've realized that, they wash their hands of it and they leave. Afghanistan, Iraq, many of the Libya, anywhere where the U.S. has intervened outside of that our Western Hemisphere, we generally haven't stuck around to make sure things stay the way we left them. I think one of the exceptions is maybe South Korea, but that war was not over. I know there's no armistice, but at that point it was definitively over. We kept troops there to dissuade the North Koreans and the Chinese from intervening again. After you read what? Last Independent Thinker. But yeah, I'm not going to talk too much else about the Russia, Ukraine, international law thing. I've talked a lot about it today. Although I do want to speak about the Orezhnik. That is a very impressive weapon. I think that this idea that the Russians can't develop advanced technology is foolish. Any country that has a military leader that openly underestimates their potential rivals should not be in that position of power. If anything, you should overestimate all of your rivals. Leading up to the Gulf War, the Iraqi army was overestimated very much. We had assumed that the United States would suffer heavy casualties intervening in Kuwait. Thankfully, those analysts were wrong, but it was better to be over-prepared for potential conflict than under-prepared. I mean, the Wehrmacht in 1941, when they invaded the Soviet Union, assumed that once the front door was kicked in, the whole Russia would come crashing down, and they constantly underestimated how many divisions the Soviets could put into the field. And once they reached, not even the gates of Moscow, but even a month or 2 months before they made it to Moscow, when they were after they had captured Kiev, they were in a panic. How do the Soviets keep putting this many men in the field? We capture millions and millions more replace them. It doesn't stop. Again, because their intelligence about Soviet capabilities was wrong. They could field far more men than they assumed, and their tanks, T-34, was a much better tank than they assumed. And despite the Soviet Union's major problems as a fighting force at that time, it was a military, I don't want to curse because of YouTube's rules, but the Soviet military was an absolute mess at that point. Communication was bad. Coordination was terrible. They had a good tank, but didn't have radios in it. Couldn't really utilize them the way they wanted. Regardless, though, the capability was there. And a few years later, well, they're marching down the streets of Berlin. So my point is, if you're the leader of a country and you're involved in the military and military decision-making, never underestimate your potential rivals and adversaries. Never assume they don't have certain capabilities. Always assume they could do more than what you see. And I think the Orezhnik is proof of that. That thing travels at, what, 10,000, 12,000 miles per hour? You can't intercept that. There's no way. Now, I'm not assuming the United States doesn't have that technology or we're not working on it. I am assuming that we do. But once everybody starts fielding technology like that, say the Russians, the Chinese, and us all have something equivalent to the Orezhnik, and you can't stop it. How do you move a carrier fleet at that point, especially as that technology becomes more accurate? How do you move your surf fleet out of port to get close to anything to utilize it if the opposing country has a bunch of those? And that's on all sides. That is I've heard some people compare it to a nuclear weapon. Once everyone has this technology, it's changing warfare. It's going to make it much, much less likely, even that the great powers will act directly against each other, especially if they all mutually have weapons that cannot be stopped or intercepted. Like with nuclear weapons, for example, they're horrible, they're terrible. I pray to God they're never used again. But they are the one thing that has ensured a third world war has not taken place because of the cost imposed on the world if those things are used. And something like the Orezhnik technology like that, I think it would probably give a nice incentive to everybody that has that kind of technology not to directly go to war with one another. Because again, if you can't stop something your enemy has and everybody has that same weapon system, at that point, what could you do against one another? Would war even be worth it at that point? If all of your assets, especially your large assets like a carrier fleet, are completely useless. Now, they're still useful against countries that don't have technology like that. Case in point, what just happened to Venezuela. Venezuela has no answer to a U.S. carrier. They don't have hypersonic missiles. What can they do? Literally nothing. Nothing at all. Last independent thinker, what's going on with your messages here, man? Why are they all being redacted? Are you being censored in my chat for some reason here? Just curious. But anywho, you were asking me if I read something and never quite came up. Anyways, yeah, just let me know when you get a chance. Well, I don't want to go on too much about that, but to sum it up, the point I'm making is sometimes there's weapon systems that are developed, especially in modern warfare, that are so destructive once major powers have those, it gives them a further incentive to not directly fight against one another and to engage more so in proxy conflicts and subterfuge and espionage and using other countries to fight on your behalf. Oh, your message was being deleted. That's weird. I don't have mods. As far as I know, nobody signed up to be a mod. I was offering you an invite. What are you offering me an invite to? Like a Discord group or something? I can't tonight. Once I hop off here, I'm going to spend some time with the family, and I'm actually going to end this live stream here in just a few minutes. Can you send? Oh, on X. Oh, okay. You can find me. Okay, right on. Cool. I have an X account, actually. Maybe I'll link it in my YouTube. So that's a way to find me. Because I actually post my YouTube videos on my X account, actually. So, yeah, I'll post that link. Or I'll try to find you, too, if you want to drop your @ or whatever. I can click on it, and I'll find you on there. But yeah, I think that's so weird. I wonder why that redacts everything. That's interesting. Anywho. Yeah, I really can't stand YouTube sometimes, just with the way things work. This is a gripe I have over YouTube, and I'm going to say this while using YouTube. So I was letting my daughter watch some Disney princess videos on my YouTube music account, which a lot of it was just wholesome content from old Disney movies. Shirley is a big fan of Frozen, Brave, older stuff too, like Snow White, Cinderella, and she likes to watch videos from musicals and the songs in those movies. and she's scrolling through stuff, and this weird like pregnancy fetish stuff kept coming up in kids videos, like mixed in with kids playlists, and you could clearly tell this is stuff made by a weirdo adult who you definitely wouldn't want around your kids, but it's still showing up in kids recommended content. You know, YouTube will censor things over the dumbest of reasons possible, censor content, you know, across the board, you know, things that really honestly aren't even, I think, that controversial. But then, you know, you go on YouTube Kids, or you pull up some kids videos on YouTube, and you get stuff made by, can I even say the word on here without getting in trouble? Made by people that are very friendly with children. We'll just say that, and the content's up there. I mean, people can clearly see why it's being made and who it's being made by and behind it. But yeah, I don't know. You know, it's, hey, we can't let people say things on YouTube that we don't like, but you know, we have videos on here made by weirdos. When your kids watch anything, this stuff is going to, you know, I took the phone from her and was like, no, we're not going to do this anymore. I thought this was a nice little playlist for kids. Turns out there's weird stuff on here that kids shouldn't be watching. So that was the end of that. So yeah, monitor the stuff your kids are watching, even if it's something that appears to be on streaming services too, where you flip through these shows that are recommended to kids, and it's some of the most disgusting slop you can imagine. Stuff that kids should not be watching. Stuff that's like suggestive, stuff that just turns kids' brains into mush, gives them the worst ADD brain you can imagine. There's like nothing good about these shows. It's not teaching any lessons, nothing wholesome. It's terrible, mindless slop, you know. But that stuff's okay. That stuff's okay. But, you know, if you send a message in an open chat that, and again, like all this stuff is being deleted. I don't even know why it's being redacted. Like, he hasn't said anything on here that I would find upsetting or offensive, and I don't know. So yeah, sorry, Last Independent Thinker, if you're dealing with this right now. Whatever. Just I don't know. Find me on X, I guess, and send me a message or whatever. Anywho, I think I'm gonna end the stream here tonight. I don't think there's anything I didn't really talk about that I wanted to talk about. Let's see here. I had a little list of things. I talked a little bit about what's happening in Minneapolis. Oh, yeah, I want to mention Iran. Oh, okay, right on. Gotcha. I want to talk about Iran real quick and what's happening in Iran. So it would appear, and see, this is one of the major problems that Iran has, and I've actually read a lot of, I got this from a lot of pro-Iranian X accounts, or people that are, I don't want to say like not pro-regime, but pro-Iran as a country. They don't want to see the country turn into a Western-style liberal democracy, but they don't like the Ayatollahs either. There is genuinely a lot of animosity and dislike of the Ayatollahs in Iran. Iran is a very ethnically diverse country, believe it or not. Most Iranians are Persians. Then you have Azeris. You have Armenians, you have Kurds, you have a lot of people that don't like the Ayatollahs. The Kurds generally are pro-Israel. The Azerbaijanians are very pro-Israel people. I think governments that don't like the Iranians are more than willing to use those groups to destabilize the country. And it seems that Iran's leadership is a little out of sync with the social mood of their populace, which again is something that's taken advantage of by outside forces that wish to destabilize the country. There's a lot of Iranians, and again, these aren't even Iranians that are pro-Israel by any means, but they're saying that the regime that is running Iran needs to get ahead of these things, needs to make changes to the way they govern society in Iran to mitigate the animosity and mitigate the political turmoil and mitigate the areas of divide in Iranian society before they get too difficult to control and maintain. And they might have reached that point tonight. These protests seem to be getting pretty bad. The United States government is mulling over direct action against the Iranian government. I'm sure at the behest of Israel, because again, Israel is not Israel, but Iran is the other hegemon competing for control of the Middle East. It is the counterbalance to Israeli influence, and Israel wants them gone and out of the way, or at least the Ayatollahs. They want the Ayatollahs gone, and Iran preferably back in the hands of Persians, I guess, with the old monarchy restored. I know the Shah, son of the Shah, I believe, he lives in Florida, and he is, I'm sure, waiting in the wings to make his move to wrest back control of the country from the Ayatollahs. Now, from what I understand, the sanctions have taken their toll on Iran. And while the Iranian populace might not be pro-Israel by any means and not necessarily pro-Western liberal democracy, I think they've got to the point, though, where they do want the Ayatollahs out of power and something else to replace them. Whether they would support a pro-Western political figure like the Shah's son, continuation of the old Western propped-up monarchy, if that's something they would stomach, I don't know. I'm not an expert on Iran. I know a little bit. I know why Iran and Israel such a conflict with one another. I know why Israel wants Iran out of the picture. I know why Iran wants Israel out of the picture, but I'm not sure what's going to happen moving forward. I don't see Russia intervening on Iran's behalf. I don't see them investing time and military assets into preserving the Iranian regime, especially if it collapses into some kind of civil war. I think they'll stay out of it. I think their interests lie more so within Syria because of the Mediterranean. I don't think the Chinese will come to Iran's rescue either. I think if it descends into a full-blown civil war, I think their support will be minimal. I think so long as they can deal with whatever government replaces the Ayatollahs, if the country does fall, then they're fine with that. Kind of how the Russians viewed the Syrian government that replaced Bashar al-Assad's. If they can still work with it, so be it. Why waste the time propping the old government up if the new government will work with them? And I think whatever government replaces the Ayatollahs, if they were smart, they would take a similar position to keep the Russians and the Chinese from interfering. Guarantee if they control the government, then they'll work with all parties interested in investing in Iran. And I'm sure Israel would probably be happy just to have the Ayatollahs out. In a different government even if it wasn't exactly pro-Israel, maybe it would be less aggressive towards them and focused more on their own internal problems. I'm sure that's how they're looking at it. But they are definitely hovering up in the trees like a bunch of vultures waiting for their moment to strike. I don't necessarily blame them, although if they are interested in doing so, please, I would much prefer if the United States stays out of it. Please leave us alone. I don't want our foreign policy guided by a foreign power anymore, especially if it's to our own detriment. I'd rather the United States not be involved in the Middle East in any capacity. Just leave it alone. If there truly is unlimited oil under Venezuela, then why be involved in the Middle East in any capacity? But again, as I mentioned before, I'm not an expert on Iran. I don't know what's going to happen. We'll see. I know a little bit about Iranian society and why things are the way they are based upon insights from people that know much more about it than me, but we'll just leave it at that. And Yemen, too, it looks like the Saudi-backed factions in Yemen have gained a pretty significant victory in the civil war that's taking place there. They've recaptured a pretty significant amount of territory in southern Yemen. And I could be wrong about this. I might be totally wrong. Looks like the Houthis still have their enclave in the western parts of Yemen, but it seems like the rest of the country has fallen to the Saudi-backed factions. From what I understand, the pro-United Arab Emirates factions have lost pretty badly. But Middle East politics, man, it's very interesting. You have a lot of these little very, very wealthy countries like the UAE, and Qatar. Really pushing out a lot of influence, trying to, and funding different groups for their own ends, and it seems like a bit of a mess. And I would much prefer it if be left to its own devices at this point, especially if there's no real interest in resources in the region for the United States. But anyways, I'm gonna end this stream tonight. I'm gonna hop off here. I'll be back later this week with another video. I do apologize. I usually do 2 videos a week. I didn't do my normal video earlier in the week due to being very busy, but I'm going to make sure that I make time to do that this week, and then I'll be back next Friday or Saturday with another live stream. So come hang out. As always, if you enjoyed this content, you enjoyed this live stream, please subscribe to my channel, drop me a like, and if you feel free to do so, share my content. And have a good one. And last independent thinker, take care. Have a good one. Stay safe there down under, and see you around.